Something changed when the person you love looked at the calendar this morning, and for a few quiet seconds, they could not move. Their eyes stopped on one particular week. Their hand rested against the edge of the table. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside them, growing cold while a thought they had been avoiding finally became impossible to ignore. Next week is coming quickly, and somewhere inside that approaching stretch of days is a decision they have not yet explained to you. You may have already felt the distance around them without knowing what caused it. Perhaps their words have become shorter. Perhaps a conversation ended too soon. Perhaps they seemed distracted at a moment when you expected warmth. None of those things happened because they suddenly stopped caring. Something practical entered their life and collided with something deeply emotional, and now they are caught between what appears necessary and what their heart is asking them not to abandon. The question is not simply whether they are leaving. The question is why they have been unable to tell you the whole reason. There is a scene they keep replaying. A few nights ago, they were alone in a dim room with only the light from their phone washing across their face. A message had arrived earlier that day confirming something they had expected, but seeing it written made it real. A date. A departure. An arrangement already being discussed by other people. They read the message once, then again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into another possibility. They nearly contacted you immediately. Their thumb even hovered above your name. But they stopped because the explanation felt too complicated to fit inside a message, and because one part of the truth frightened them more than the departure itself. They wondered how you would interpret it. Would you think they were walking away from you? Would you believe someone else mattered more? Would you decide that their silence proved everything you had secretly feared? That is why they placed the phone face down and walked toward the window instead. Outside, headlights moved along the street like distant rivers of light. Everything in the world seemed to be continuing normally while their own future suddenly felt divided into two directions. They knew that if they told you only the visible part of the story, you might misunderstand everything. Yet telling you the deeper part would require admitting something they have spent a long time hiding. Their feelings for you have become much more serious than they intended. At first, they believed they could control the connection. They told themselves not to imagine too far ahead. They tried to stay logical, especially whenever circumstances became uncertain. But then ordinary moments began betraying them. They would hear something funny and instinctively think about telling you. They would pass a place and imagine you beside them. They would wake after a difficult night and wonder what you were doing. These were not dramatic declarations. They were smaller and more dangerous because they happened naturally, without permission. And now the possibility of leaving next week has forced them to measure what your absence would actually feel like. That realization unsettled them. The next morning, someone close to them noticed. "You're quiet," the person said. "I'm thinking." "About the trip?" There was a pause. "Not exactly." The answer surprised even them. Because the trip, move, visit, or temporary departure, whatever shape this change finally takes, is not the central issue anymore. You are. The person across from them must have understood something from their expression because they did not ask another question immediately. Instead, they waited. And in that silence, the person you love finally said words they had avoided speaking aloud. There's someone I don't want to leave confused. Not someone they wanted to escape. Not someone they were finished with. Someone they did not want to leave confused. That difference matters. But there is another part you do not yet know. The original plan was made before their feelings became this intense. Weeks earlier, perhaps months earlier, they had agreed to something that seemed reasonable at the time. It involved responsibility, family, work, opportunity, obligation, or unfinished business somewhere else. They assumed they would simply go, handle what needed to be handled, and return to life without much emotional disruption. Then the connection between you changed. Maybe there was one conversation that lingered. Maybe you showed them kindness when they expected judgment. Maybe you stepped back instead of chasing them, and your absence revealed your importance more clearly than your presence ever had. Whatever the moment was, it shifted something permanent inside them. Suddenly, next week was no longer just a date. It became a test. Could they leave without saying what was true? Could they board that plane, enter that car, pack that suitcase, or walk into that new situation while pretending you were only a passing chapter? They tried convincing themselves they could. But yesterday something happened that made pretending much harder. They came across something connected to you. It may have been an old message. A photograph. A voice note. A memory triggered by a song they were not expecting to hear. Whatever form it took, it brought back one specific moment between you when they had almost revealed how much they cared. At the time, they swallowed the words. Now they remembered the exact expression on your face, and suddenly the distance between what they felt and what they had actually shown you became painfully clear. They realized you might have no idea. You might believe you were the only one carrying the emotional weight. You might have mistaken their caution for indifference. And that possibility affected them more deeply than they expected. They sat down and opened a blank message to you. The first line came quickly. I need to tell you something before next week. Then they stared at it. Deleted it. Typed again. There's something about next week you should hear from me. Deleted that too. The problem was not finding words for the departure. The problem was finding words for everything the departure had revealed. Because once they start telling you the truth, they may not be able to stop halfway. They would have to tell you that your presence has quietly become part of the way they imagine home. They would have to admit they have thought about what it would feel like to lose contact with you. They would have to explain that certain choices they once considered easy now feel completely different because you exist inside the equation. And there is one confession above all others they are afraid to make. They are not certain they want to leave anymore. That thought first appeared as a whisper, almost ridiculous in its simplicity. What if I change the plan? They immediately pushed it away. Commitments had already been made. Expectations existed. People were involved. Changing course would create questions. It might disappoint someone. It might make their life more complicated. But the thought returned. What if I stayed? Then came another thought. What if leaving is necessary, but losing you is not? That was the beginning of the real turning point. Instead of asking whether they should go, they began asking what the departure actually means for the relationship between you. Could this become a temporary distance rather than an ending? Could honesty happen before they leave? Could there be a conversation that changes the shape of everything? That is when they started imagining something they had previously been too cautious to picture, you waiting not because you were being abandoned, but because both of you finally understood what you were waiting for. Still, they have not contacted you yet. And the reason may surprise you. They are waiting for one final piece of information. Earlier today, they received a call connected to the plans for next week. The conversation did not go as expected. Something about the departure may be changing its timing, its purpose, perhaps even its necessity. They listened carefully while the person on the other end explained a new development. At one point, they walked away from everyone else because they did not want anyone to hear their reaction. "So it isn't final?" they asked. "Not completely." Those two words changed the atmosphere. Not completely. When the call ended, they remained standing in the hallway, staring down at the screen. For the first time in days, uncertainty did not feel frightening. It felt like an opening. But before relief could settle in, another question appeared. If the plan changes, what will they do with the feelings they can no longer blame on the pressure of leaving? Until now, they could tell themselves their emotions were intensified by circumstances. They could pretend they only missed you because separation was approaching. But if the separation disappears and the feelings remain, then they will have to face something much more permanent. They may truly love you. That realization has begun changing their behavior in subtle ways. They have been looking back at conversations with new eyes. Moments they once dismissed now feel significant. They remember the patience in your voice when they were difficult to understand. They remember the times you gave them space without making them earn your kindness afterward. They remember something you said casually that stayed with them for days because it made them feel seen in a place they rarely allow others to see. And they are beginning to understand something about you too. You were never asking for perfection. You were asking for clarity. That is what they failed to give you. Not because they wanted to hurt you, but because clarity would have required courage before they were ready to offer it. Now next week is approaching, and courage has become more urgent than comfort. Tonight, there may be another conversation in their life. Someone close to them is expected to ask what they intend to do. This person knows enough to sense that you are part of the decision, even if your name has not been mentioned openly. The person you love already knows what question is coming. Are you still going? They have rehearsed several answers. I have to. I'm not sure. Things changed. But none of those answers fully explain what happened inside them. The most truthful answer would be something they have never said aloud. I don't want to make a choice that closes the door on this person. That person is you. And yet, there is still another layer. Because while they were thinking through everything this afternoon, they discovered that someone else had already spoken about you. Not maliciously. Not to separate you. The opposite. A person who understands them better than they realized apparently noticed the connection long before they were willing to admit it. During a private conversation, this person said something that stopped them cold. You keep talking about next week like the place you're going is the important part. But every time you mention leaving, you look like you're thinking about who you're leaving behind. They had no response. The room became very still. Then the person continued. If they matter, don't make them guess. Those words have followed them all day. Don't make them guess. Because that is exactly what they have been doing. Leaving you to interpret silence. Leaving you to wonder whether distance means rejection. Leaving you with fragments while they carry the complete picture. And something inside them is beginning to reject that pattern. They are tired of hiding behind timing. Tired of waiting for certainty before speaking from the heart. Tired of imagining conversations instead of having them. But before you assume the outcome is already decided, understand this: there is still one obstacle they have not overcome. They fear that they waited too long. They wonder whether you have already begun protecting your heart from them. They wonder whether you would believe them now. They wonder if opening up right before a possible departure would seem unfair, as though they were asking you to hold an emotional promise while they go somewhere else. This is why their next move matters so much. They do not want to simply confess. They want to offer something real. A plan. An intention. A reason for you to trust that their words are not temporary emotions created by an approaching goodbye. And that is where the biggest revelation begins. Late this afternoon, they opened the itinerary for next week. They looked at the date. The departure time. The confirmation details. Then they opened another page. A cancellation and change screen. For several minutes, they did nothing. Their finger rested above an option that could alter the entire arrangement. They were not acting impulsively. Their expression was calm, almost strangely calm, because by then they had reached a realization that had been building beneath every nervous thought. Leaving may still happen. But they are no longer willing to leave you believing it means they chose a life without you. That distinction has become non-negotiable inside them. So they closed the cancellation page without confirming anything. Then they opened your conversation. This time, they did not type a vague message. They wrote something longer. Something honest. Something that began with the truth about next week but quickly became a confession about the months leading up to it. They admitted that they had been scared. They admitted the distance was not what it seemed. They admitted that the possibility of leaving forced them to acknowledge feelings they had been trying to control. And then they wrote one sentence that made them stop. They read it 3 times. Their eyes filled, not with panic, but with the emotion of someone seeing their own heart clearly for the first time. The sentence said, "I thought next week was taking me away from you, but now I think it may be the reason I finally tell you where I want my life to lead." They did not send it. Not yet. Because just as their finger moved toward the screen, another message appeared at the top of their phone. It came from the person responsible for the plans next week. There were only a few words visible in the notification. Something changed. Call me before you decide anything. And the person you love froze. Because what they heard during that call may determine whether next week becomes a goodbye, a delay, or the beginning of something neither of you expected. The phone remained in their hand for several seconds before they finally pressed the call button. One ring. Then another. When the voice answered, the person you love stepped away from the window and closed the door behind them. They expected complications. Another change of schedule. Perhaps an earlier departure. Perhaps confirmation that everything they had been worrying about was now unavoidable. Instead, the voice on the other end said something completely different. You don't have to come next week. Silence. They thought they had misunderstood. What do you mean? The situation changed this afternoon. What we needed you there for can be handled another way. If you still want to come, you can. But you're no longer obligated. For days, they had imagined hearing exactly those words. They expected relief to rush through them. But something stranger happened. They sat down. Because suddenly the decision belonged entirely to them. There was no obligation to hide behind anymore. No circumstance to blame. No schedule forcing their hand. They could leave. They could stay. And whichever choice they made would reveal what they genuinely wanted. The person on the phone continued explaining details, but their attention had already moved somewhere else. They were thinking about your conversation still open on the screen. They were thinking about the message they had almost sent. They were thinking about all the times fear had disguised itself as practicality. When the call finally ended, they whispered, "Okay." But that word was not meant for the person who had just hung up. It was meant for themselves. Okay. No more excuses. They walked back toward the window where they had stood only days earlier, staring at passing headlights while wondering how to explain their departure to you. The same street stretched below them now. The same buildings. The same evening sounds. Yet everything felt different because the question had changed. They were no longer asking, "How do I leave?" They were asking, "What do I actually want?" And your face came immediately to mind. Not an idealized version of you. Not some perfect fantasy. They remembered the real you, the way you sometimes became quiet when something mattered deeply, the way your words carried warmth even when you were protecting yourself, the moments when you tried to understand them instead of demanding immediate answers. They remembered your imperfections too. The misunderstandings. The awkward pauses. The conversations that could have gone better. And somehow those memories made their realization stronger. Because what they wanted was not a flawless story. They wanted a truthful one. They wanted the chance to discover what could happen between two imperfect people who finally stopped hiding. So they returned to the message they had written. Their thumb hovered above send. This time, they did not delete anything. They added one more line. The plans changed, but even if they hadn't, I needed you to know this. Then they pressed send. There was no dramatic sound. No thunder. No cinematic signal announcing that everything had changed. Just a tiny movement of their thumb against glass. Yet emotionally, it was the biggest step they had taken in a very long time. The message was gone from their side of the silence. Now it belonged to you. And suddenly they understood why honesty had frightened them so much. Once you tell someone what they mean to you, you cannot control what happens next. You cannot edit their reaction. You cannot force timing. You cannot guarantee that they will answer with the words you hope to hear. You simply place something true into their hands and trust them with it. That vulnerability made their heart pound harder than the possibility of leaving ever had. Minutes passed. They put the phone down. Picked it up again. Walked into another room. Returned. They told themselves not to stare at the screen, then checked it anyway. Nothing. For a moment, the old fear returned. Maybe they had waited too long. Maybe you had become tired of deciphering mixed signals. Maybe the silence they created had finally taught you how to live without expecting anything from them. And for the first time, they understood what their uncertainty may have felt like from your side. That understanding hurt. But it also matured something inside them. Because they made themselves a promise in that moment. Even if your answer was not what they wanted, they would not punish you for protecting your heart. They would not disappear. They would not become cold because vulnerability had made them uncomfortable. They would accept the consequences of having waited so long to speak. That was when their phone lit up. Your name appeared. They stared at it. All the imagined speeches vanished. All the rehearsed explanations suddenly seemed useless. Because real moments rarely arrive exactly as we practice them. Their hand shook slightly when they answered. Hello? Your voice came through. Quiet. Careful. Real. I read what you sent. They closed their eyes. I meant it. Another pause. Then you asked the question they had been afraid you would ask. Why now? There it was. Not anger. Not accusation. Just the question that deserved an answer. Why now? They could have blamed next week. They could have blamed circumstances. Instead, they chose honesty. Because I kept thinking I needed to understand everything before I talked to you. And I finally realized I was using uncertainty as an excuse. You said nothing. So they continued. I was scared that if I told you how much you mattered, things would become real in a way I couldn't control. Their voice softened. And then I thought I was leaving, and I realized losing the chance to tell you was worse than being afraid. Something shifted in the silence between you. Not everything was repaired instantly. That would have been too easy. Trust does not rebuild itself because one beautiful message arrives at the right moment. Hearts remember confusion. They remember unanswered questions. So you asked another. Were you really going to leave without telling me? They looked down. Yes. The answer hurt them to admit. I almost did. Then came the part that mattered. And that would have been wrong. No justification. No elaborate defense. Just accountability. I thought staying quiet would protect both of us from something complicated. But I understand now that it only made you carry questions I should have answered. Your breathing was audible through the phone. They waited. Finally, you said something they had not expected. I thought your silence was the answer. Those words landed differently from everything else. The person you love stood completely still. Because suddenly they saw what had almost happened. Two people could care deeply for each other and still lose one another, not because love was absent, but because fear had been louder than communication. They whispered your name. I'm sorry. This time, the apology did not feel like an attempt to erase the past. It felt like recognition. Then they told you everything. They explained the original reason for next week. The responsibility that had created the plan. The call. The changed circumstances. The fact that they were no longer required to go. But they also told you something more important. I don't want the change in plans to be the reason you believe me. You listened. I want you to know that before I found out I could stay, I had already decided I wasn't going to let leaving become an ending between us. That was the truth hidden beneath the entire story. The cancellation did not create their feelings. It merely removed the obstacle that had forced those feelings into the open. And now there was one final question. So what happens next? You asked. They almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because after all the imagined drama, the future had arrived disguised as the simplest question in the world. What happens next? They answered slowly. We stop guessing. That was all. Not a grand promise about forever. Not an impossible guarantee. Something better. A beginning built on clarity. We talk. Really talk. And if you still want to explore this with me, I want to do it without making you wonder where you stand. You were quiet for several seconds. Then you said, I can do that. 4 ordinary words. Yet they changed the entire emotional landscape. I can do that. Not because every wound had vanished. Not because uncertainty had disappeared. But because both of you were finally standing on the same side of the truth. The person you love sat down, and for the first time all week, their shoulders relaxed. The calendar still showed next week. But the date no longer looked like a deadline. It looked like space. Space for a conversation that had been postponed too long. Space for 2 people to meet without pretending. Space for something new to be built deliberately rather than imagined privately. And there was one more decision to make. The next morning, they opened the travel itinerary again. This time there was no trembling hand. They reviewed the details carefully and chose to postpone the journey. Not because love demanded they abandon responsibilities. Not because a relationship should require someone to throw away their life. They postponed it because the original urgency no longer existed, and they wanted to use the unexpected time wisely. They wanted to see you. When they told you, they were careful. I'm not doing this so you owe me anything. Those words mattered. I'm doing it because I have a choice now, and I want to spend some of that choice being honest with you. That was different. Healthy love does not arrive carrying an invoice. It does not say, look what I sacrificed, so now you must choose me. It says, here is what I freely chose. You are still free too. And perhaps that was the deepest change inside them. They were no longer trying to control the ending. They were finally willing to participate honestly in the beginning. When you eventually met, the moment was quieter than either of you had imagined. No dramatic crowd. No perfect soundtrack. Just 2 people facing each other with months of unspoken things between them. For a second, neither knew what to say. Then the person you love smiled nervously. You're really here. You smiled back. So are you. And somehow that broke the tension. You talked. Not for 5 minutes. Not through carefully edited messages. You talked until the light outside changed. They told you where their fear came from. You told them what their silence had done to you. There were moments when one of you looked away because the truth felt uncomfortable. But neither ran. That mattered more than perfect words. At one point, they reached across the space between you. They stopped before touching your hand. A small gesture. A question without pressure. You moved your hand closer. And when your fingers finally met, there was no sense that every uncertainty had magically disappeared. There was something more meaningful. Mutual willingness. The willingness to see. To listen. To repair. To discover. The willingness to let love become something lived instead of something secretly imagined. And that, beloved child, is why the truth coming out was never really about someone leaving next week. The deeper story was about what the possibility of departure revealed. It revealed how easily fear can disguise itself as patience. How silence can be mistaken for rejection. How two hearts can stand surprisingly close while each believes the other is moving away. But it revealed something hopeful too. Sometimes an approaching ending forces people to finally say what should have been spoken at the beginning. Sometimes the door that appears to be closing simply teaches someone which door they truly want to keep open. The person you love did not need a miracle that removed every complication. They needed courage. And so did you. The future between you will still require conversations. There will be days when old fears attempt to return. There may eventually be journeys, responsibilities, or distances that cannot be postponed. But now there is something that did not exist before. Truth. And truth gives love a place to stand. So carry this fictional story with you not as a prediction, but as a reminder. You deserve relationships where questions can become conversations, where affection does not depend on endless guessing, and where people are allowed to be honest without controlling one another. May your heart be blessed with clarity when circumstances feel uncertain. May you recognize the difference between temporary distance and true abandonment. May you have courage to speak when silence becomes heavier than honesty, wisdom to listen when another heart finally opens, and peace to release anything that cannot meet you with sincerity. May the love meant to enrich your life never require you to lose yourself to keep it. May your next chapter contain fewer unanswered questions, deeper conversations, gentler mornings, and people whose actions bring calm to the promises of their words. And when life places you at a crossroads, may you remember this: sometimes the most important decision is not whether someone stays or leaves. It is whether truth finally gets invited into the room. If this story touched something meaningful in your heart, share in the comments what part stayed with you most. Like the video if you want more cinematic stories of love, hope, courage, and unexpected revelation, and subscribe so you can join us for the next journey. Until then, may peace guard your heart, may wisdom guide your choices, and may whatever comes next lead you closer to a life filled with honest love, quiet strength, and beautiful beginnings.